Returning to our MSNBC special coverage of President Obama's address to the Republican policy retreat at Baltimore, and we were looking at the president's answer to Congressman Mike Pence of Indiana. We pick up the president's response right where we left off. It's about 4 minutes long, this segment. The president making the point that the stimulus bill was not a radical package. He then addresses whether he would consider an across-the-board tax cut.
This notion that this was a radical package is just not true. A third of them were tax cuts, and they weren't, when you say they were boutique tax cuts, Mike, 95% of working Americans got tax cuts. Small businesses got tax cuts. Large businesses got help in terms of their depreciation schedules. I mean, it was a pretty conventional list of tax cuts. A third of it was stabilizing state budgets. There is not a single person in here who, had it not been for what was in the stimulus package, wouldn't be going home to more teachers laid off, more firefighters laid off, more cops laid off. A big chunk of it was unemployment insurance and COBRA. Just making sure that people had some floor beneath them. And, by the way, making sure that there was enough money in their pockets that businesses had some customers. You take those two things out, that accounts for the majority of the stimulus package. Are there people in this room who think that was a bad idea? A portion of it was dealing with the AMT, right? The alternative minimum tax. Not a proposal of mine. That's not a consequence of my policies, that we have a tax system where we keep on putting off a potential tax hike that is embedded in the budget that we have to fix each year. That cost about $70 billion. And then the last portion of it was infrastructure, which, as I said, a lot of you have gone to appear at ribbon cuttings for the same projects that you voted against. Now, I say all this not to relitigate the past, but it's simply to state that the component parts of the Recovery Act are consistent with what many of you say are important things to do. Rebuilding our infrastructure, tax cuts for families and businesses, and making sure that we were providing states and individuals some support when the roof was caving in. And the notion that I would somehow resist doing something that cost half as much but would produce twice as many jobs, why would I resist that? I wouldn't. I mean, that's my point, is that I am not an ideologue. I'm not. It doesn't make sense if somebody could tell me you could do this cheaper and get increased results, that I wouldn't say great. The problem is I couldn't find credible economists who would back up the claims that you just made. What you may consider across-the-board tax cuts could be, for example, greater tax cuts for people who are making $1 billion. I may not agree to a tax cut for Warren Buffett. You may be calling for a across-the-board tax cut for the banking industry right now. I may not agree to that. So, I think that we've got to look at what specific proposals you're putting forward. And this is the last point I'll make. If you're calling for just across-the-board tax cuts, and then on the other hand saying that we're somehow going to balance our budget, I'm going to want to take a look at your math and see how that works. Because the issue of deficit and debt is another area where there has been a tendency for some inconsistent statements. How's that? All right?
Apart from the sort of stagecraft, Rachel, of the, how's that all right part? The little one-liners that really have no room for a response. you were at all these ribbon-cutting ceremonies for things that you are opposing still after they've happened.
Yeah, and that's something that he mentioned in his speech at the beginning. He mentioned it in this part of the back and forth again, and that's one of these things that Republicans have sort of been able to get away with. Again, it's about increasing the cost for things that Republicans are doing that are theoretically going to politically cost them, but so far haven't. By putting a presidential spotlight on them, he's hoping that he can. Phil Gingrey, for example, I think we've got a photo of this. Phil Gingrey, Georgia congressman, here he is at one of these ribbon-cutting ceremonies. This is a $625,000 check to the City Commission of Cedar Township in Georgia for a streetscape beautification project. And then Gingrey, of course, inveighing against the stimulus project that made this money possible.
Chris, what objectively did the Republicans expect was going to happen today, especially when they made the decision to let them televise the question and answer session? Do you know?
Well, I don't think they expected this much. Can I just add to what to Rachel did? This is the kind of politics I love. When you bring politics to people in a clear way. Back in the old days when I worked for Tip O'Neill, the Republican leader was screaming about this stupid Democratic jobs bill. I called the chief engineer in Peoria, Bob Michaels engineer, in his home state, home district. I got the list of all the bridges below safety code. I gave him to the speaker. He went on the floor and listed all the bridges in Bob Michael, the Republican leader's district, that were below safety code. So if a school bus went over it, there'd be a problem. He went out and listed them. Bob Michael's face turned red. He went running to the back of the House chamber looking for his press secretary in high damage control. The more you do this, if you're a Democratic president or leader, and show the real-life implications of this Republican obstructionism, the more you're going to seem like a real leader. The trouble so far with the president, and you know this, Rachel and Keith, is that so much of this argument over the stimulus bill has been like Harvey. I've got this thing called the stimulus bill. You can't see it, but it's really great. You got to bring it home to people in real-life local situations like Rachel just did with that picture, and show that they are involved in real-life job creation. If you can do that, you can win this argument.
Bob Michaels, engineer. Imagine what you could do now, Chris, if you'd had Google then. Representative Paul Ryan.
It was more fun when we didn't. I got it because you nailed the guy. You didn't know what you're up to. We had a Democratic chief engineer in Peoria. We got him from behind.
Representative Paul Ryan questioned Mr. Obama about conservative worries about runaway spending. The two men went back and forth for 5 minutes. That exchange in its entirety when Rachel, Chris, and I rejoin you next.